Hi, so the Electric Human Part 2, and this one is called The Trace. And the idea here is that there's a trace through world history, our history, human history of the aura or energy field, electromagnetic field being detected. And it's happened all around the world. The situation we have now is we don't have a machine that can detect the aura, so we don't have a little thing like a cell phone that can go around seeing auras and measuring and seeing the colors. If we had that, it would be indisputable. But at the moment, the only machine that can do it is our own technology, the eye, the senses. And these seem to vary between people. It switches on, sometimes switches off, certain ecologies it switches on. A lot of people, when they're children, they can have this experience of seeing lights or energy around people. Anyone who's got a cat will have that moment when the cat seems to be looking up above your head. Is it seeing something in the energy worlds? We know that bats, for example, use a kind of sonar system that's energy to detect and fly to recognize where objects are. But one of the interesting studies to really bring pieces together to make more sense of this area is to look at where it has been depicted in world history. And even the terminology around the world, in Islam they call it baraka, this human energy system. You have the prana or shakti of the Indian Hindu system. You have chi in China, you have ki in Japan, you have mana in Maori and some of the Pacific Islands. And so different words for the same idea. It's interesting to think that perhaps it was considered normal to see these things at one time in history. And one of the traces I'm suggesting here is that at one time it was actually easier to see the aura and see energies. These days we seem to be living in a weakened atmosphere, although a lot of things again point to a change and that the energies keep becoming thicker again, and therefore we're going to start seeing things and sensing things. And again, this is one of the reasons for this series on the electric human. So was it already like this at one time, that people could see energy and it was more commonplace? And I'm from New Zealand, now live in Brazil. I recall once in a lecture, it was to do with these subjects, I was watching a lecture and it was in this area, this territory. I saw the Maori design electrically on a person's face. And I had already had this notion passed to me, but it was the first time I saw for myself that exact design as a kind of spiraling magnetic field along the skin. It was just for about 3 seconds, but for a moment, the person looked like they had a tattoo. It was long enough to see it. And this is where the trace comes in, because for a long time now, it is an actual tattoo, amazing tattoos they have. But the question is, was there a time when it was seen, like I saw that night, and it represented something, represented a certain status or power? Over time, this ability, let's say the charge in the air got weaker, it wasn't anybody's fault, it just simply became more difficult to see these things. If the air is more charged, we say sometimes when there's been some sort of tense situation, you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. You've heard that expression. The atmosphere got so thick you could cut it with a knife. And you sometimes have this with people. There's a misunderstanding or that moment when energy is not flowing and the energy seems to suddenly build up, right? And you have that expression to diffuse the situation. Something is said to lower the charge. There's a lot of terminology in English, and I'm sure in other languages. I only speak English, Portuguese, and some bad Spanish. You have the expression, for example, the person in charge, which is a reference to the energy. Does the person in charge generally have more energy coming through them? Even with an orchestra, you call the person who really is the focal point for everybody the conductor, which is a reference to energy as well. But anyway, getting back to the trace. So let's say the Maori started to lose the ability to see the tattoo, and it started being understood that people were having difficulty to see. So it passed into an actual physical depiction rather than electrical. And there are other indications. There's indications like Pope used to have, I'm not sure if he still wears, but the little hat that he would wear, the keeper it's called, was made of silk, and he used to wear silk gloves. And silk is an interesting substance because it insulates the human energy field. They used to make silk curtains around the beds in Victorian times because it was understood it would protect from ghosts and phantoms and things like that. So wearing the silk kept the energy of the aura more contained. You see it a lot with Japanese emperors too. They wear a lot of silk to keep their energy contained rather than it dissipating. And here's an interesting thought with this trace. If it was once charged, the atmosphere of the planet, and it was easy to see and sense these things, there would have been a stage when it was dissipating, leaking, leading to the time that we're in now, where basically people don't see or sense these things. A few people, and maybe it's changing. I think it is changing. But there was this phase when it was coming down and dissipating. And the question is, were there attempts to try to keep it? Now, I mentioned one attempt, which was the silk. Here's another, stone circles. All around the world, stone circles. And many different countries. The most famous one, of course, is Stonehenge. But I've been to Peru, there's stone circles there. There are stone circles in Japan. There's stone circles in France, Ireland, Scotland, all around the world, stone circles. A stone circle is an interesting arrangement because what it's doing is it's causing energy to stay within a certain zone, to be held. Because by doing that, the energy doesn't leak out. It keeps itself contained, or it's kept contained within a certain space. So when we're speaking about energy, it's interesting to think that a few thousand years ago, I would say about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and back in time, the energy of the planet was more charged. And people saw these things. Because they saw it, they would have thought of it as basically normal, and it wouldn't be treated like something over special. Only as it started getting lost and you see the evidence to preserve it, there's more things we can see because there were things made to try to preserve that energy. But further back in time, you get curious references. Like in the Bible, there's a phrase where it says, when Solomon finished praying, a fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And you have to ask, well, is that symbolic when they talk about Moses in the desert and the burning bush and the flame? Literal, like there was actually some sort of energy there. You know, when Moses first came down from the mountain with the tablets, the Ten Commandments, the original version says that he was actually corneous. In other words, he had horns. The Michelangelo statue shows horns, which is another subject to do with what might happen to the head if more energy comes into it. Does it start to have alterations? This is another conversation. But they actually took that out and changed it in the Bible to say that he was a luminous, and easier to explain, but difficult to explain to the children why Moses would have horns. But the point being that all around the world, when they wanted to say that a person was catching special energy, or maybe preserving, or maybe accessing energy that we all should have, this person was still able to do it, or pathfinding in the area, they had a luminosity around the head. This brings up a subject we'll come to next time, which is about auras within the aura. Because it's not all one thing. There's all different radiations and zones to the aura quite clearly. And the same thing around the Earth. There's different spots where energy is stronger or weaker or even not so good. So this trace is saying that there was a time when these things were seen and mentioned, the glory of God filling the temple. The Mayan had different sacred spots with energy and certain groves and certain places in their mountains, and these weren't simply invented or imaginary. They were detected as strong energy zones. Many of these people were shocked when later Westerners arrived or other cultures arrived and they couldn't detect this same energy zone. So very high conductive energy, strong atmospheres facilitating not only electrical vision, but ability to have telepathy, and then weaker atmospheres or a weakening atmosphere over a 2,000 to 3,000 year period. And then we've been in a period where the atmosphere is quite weak, except for isolated places and isolated situations. But now there's a chance that things are changing. The Maori have a phrase, kahinga ti aria, which means the curtain or the veil will fall. And the idea is that there is some sort of change occurring, and you could compare it to the seasons. You know, in some countries, winter is radically different to summer, and spring is radically different to winter. Where I live now in Bahia, Brazil, the seasons are not that distinct, but growing up in New Zealand, yeah, the seasons are very distinct. And there's cosmic seasons as well, and perhaps this conductivity reaches high points, and like most things in nature, it rises from high to low and back high again. And it is interesting that after the winter, there's this jump into spring. Have we just been through a winter? Is there a spring coming? And does this mean that we're going to have to talk about, think about, and get used to our own energies, energies around us, energies in places we go to, and start to include it more in our perception and living experience? I believe this is the case. It's part of my own personal experience and many people around me and then people that I pass these ideas to and work with. And I think it simply has to start coming back into our cognizance, the same way that if you've been living in the summer and winter comes, you need to learn about the winter and what you need to survive the winter. In this case, I think something very amazing, but I think also if you get too much too soon or you're not aware of what's happening, it can cause instabilities in the emotions, in the nerves, and in the mind. So part of the reason for this conversation, I hope you're finding it interesting, and I'll see you in session 3 of The Electric Human.